AC, it is December 2023.
Yep.
We have pushed ourselves to the furthest edges beyond Hammerland. There's nowhere else to go. Or is there? We'll talk about it at the end of the show. But today, we're going to end the year as we began with a Vincent Price film. We're going to be talking today about 1968's The Witchfinder General, directed by Michael
Michael
Reeves.
Reeves. Yep.
Yes. I had the name on the tip of my tongue and I spit it out and I had to get it back. This is probably one of the most unique Hammer films that we've talked about. It's certainly a callback to what Peter Cushing was doing with his Dr. Frankenstein character when we were talking about those movies a couple of years back. But I think this might be one of the only cases where we're talking about a true Hammer style film where there is no monster except for the human protagonist. Because even in the Cushing Frankensteins, we were dealing with the Frankenstein monster, and there's sort of this supernatural element to it.
Right.
This film is all about people and the rotten things they'll do to each other in the name of spirituality, religion, and power.
Right.
I thank you for recommending it to me, but also you're going to be getting a hefty bill in the mail from my shrink because this movie did stuff to me, man. I don't know what happened here.
It is not the feel good movie of the year, and I think I like the idea that we're bookending with the two Vincent Price, because in Theater of Blood, like, that's Vincent Price having a high old time. Like, he's showing that Vincent Price twinkle in his eye. And the other end of the spectrum is this one, where he is cold and dark, and it's probably the scariest, I think, I've ever seen Vincent Price be. Like, I think there's no hint of camp. There's no like delighting in the fact that he's doing the show. Like, this was something that he and Michael Reeves butted heads on throughout the entire film. It was not a happy filming experience for either of them.
I can't imagine it being a happy experience for anybody involved. There's just trauma after trauma after trauma. But okay, so set this up for me. Who is Matthew Hopkins? What is a witchfinder, and what's the story about?
Well, in 1645, Cromwell, is running England, and the Inquisition, such as it is in full swing, where you could point fingers at people and say, "Well, that person's a witch," and things would go poorly for that person, because it's very hard to prove you're not a witch, it turns out, because they have all sorts of tests that are kind of a no-win situation. Like, if I throw you in the moat and you sink, well, then you weren't a witch, but you're dead. If you do float, well, then you're a witch, and they pull you out and they hang you or they burn you. So it's a pretty raw deal. And that's why, we see that in films like The Crucible, where, and there's a lot of these kind of witch hunting movies out there, and they're always very dark. Mark of the Devil is another one where it's just like, wow, like, people are just awful to each other. And oftentimes it was done in the name of politics, of wanting to get somebody out of power, or to get somebody else's land, or just to defer suspicion from yourself. Rather than have somebody accuse you, you would accuse somebody else.
Yeah, and that's definitely where we find ourselves here. Matthew Hopkins, played by Vincent Price, he's an older gentleman who roams the countryside with his sort of a sidekick, a guy named John Stearne, who's basically he's the person who gets the confessions out of the out of the accused witches by any means necessary. He has no compunction about puncturing people, slapping, beating women who are chained to walls, beating men who are chained up to walls. Just awful and brutish people. But they have this weird kind of rapport where they're not exactly friends, but they're not exactly an employee-employer relationship. It's almost like they both realize that they're damned, so they're having as good a time on earth as they possibly can without really ever cracking a smile.
Right. Well, I mean, I think Stern enjoys himself a little bit more, and I think he also makes no bones about it. He doesn't think he's doing anything important. He likes his job because it allows him to employ his sadistic nature, and he likes the money. And he likes the power that goes along with it. The fact that he is very much above the law because they are the law.
And we're kind of jumping ahead here, but it's a sort of a philosophical point I wanted to ask you about. Hopkins, do you think he was ever a man of faith? Do you think he ever believed in what he was doing, or is he strictly an opportunist? Because I I think it's in the way Price presents himself, and certainly the dress, the accoutrement, and the kind of the air of the haughtiness of it. He strikes
Yeah.
me as someone who's a very pious figure, but in
Mhm.
his actions and certainly in behind closed doors, I just see him as a scumbag who saw an opportunity and took it.
Well, and that's how I think I see it as well. Like, I don't think that he ever thought he was doing God's work. I think he simply realizes the power that he can wield, and you have that moment where because the Witchfinder General is not an actual position, like it's not an actual thing, like it's something that people have started to call him, and he's like, I think that should be my actual title. I think I should be Witchfinder General. I think Parliament should appoint me such. But yeah, I think he's high on the power of it. He loves. I mean, what's not to like? You can drift into town and be seen as a figure of authority and be richly rewarded for it. You can have any woman you choose. You can strike down anybody who bothers you. It's a pretty good. It's as Mel Brooks says in History of the World. It's good to be the king.
Well, yes, but it's certainly not good to be anybody who is in the crosshairs of our antagonist. um, because we meet Richard and Sarah. They are a young couple in love. Sarah's uncle is he a priest, or he's some kind of a
He's a
he's a man
priest.
of
Yeah.
okay, he's a man of authority and renown in this small town. Didn't mean to rhyme there, but he loves his niece. She's in love with Richard, who is part of Cromwell's army. We see him a lot of this movie does a really good job of setting things up of who these people are in their regular lives before they're confronted with this awful witchfinder. But eventually the witchfinder makes his way to this village and basically interrogates, tortures, arrests the priest character. um, and Sarah, she offers herself to this guy, saying, "Let my uncle go. He's a good man. He hasn't done anything. Um, I can't probably convince you of any of that, but if I give myself to you, maybe you'll go easy on him." Witchfinder's like, "Sure," and that works out for him until it doesn't, and he orders the uncle to be killed. Richard finds out that his betrothed has been violated in all sorts of horrible ways. And yeah, so it's almost like this cat and mouse game across the English countryside as the Witchfinder and Stearne go to like various towns, sort of setting up shop and moving on. And Richard, who vows at one point bloody revenge, but he's still in the army, so he has to work his path of revenge in with the orders that he gets to, I guess,
Right.
go find a runaway king, because eventually he gets promoted, and it's there's a great symmetry because the Witchfinder gets quote unquote promoted at the same time Richard does. So these
Yep.
ascending powers that are running parallel and getting closer to each other at the same time. It's a fascinating movie, but it's one of the ugliest films I've ever seen. The blood curdling screams that emanate from so many of the main characters, beginning from a woman. The opening scene is a woman being dragged up to the hillside to these gallows and hung, and she screams until she doesn't. Sarah is assaulted in just I don't think I'll ever get that sound out of my head. And the visual of her being raped on a farm, we don't see it happen, but we cut away to the bystander kind of trotting by on horseback, looking over, seeing something like, "Hey, that's kind of cool." Then he turns and just like walks away into the distance as this horrible thing is happening. I mean, it's ghastly, and I think it's hard to believe this movie was made in '68. I feel like this could be re-released today in Oscar season and say way more about the topics that people have been talking about in the last 5 years than I think the movies that are actually trying to tackle that subject.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, this was certainly violent for its time. This kind of predates Sam Peckinpah. It is hot on the heels of Bonnie and Clyde. It actually lands right in between those two. But Peckinpah actually was so impressed with this film that he borrowed Reeves's cinematographer and used him on The Wild Bunch and Straw
Whoa.
Dogs and things like that. So there's definitely an attention to, and the blood feels very Peckinpah as well. Like people get shot and there's like a lot of blood and people get stabbed and as you said people get slapped around and until their faces are bloody. So yeah, it's a rough movie, and it did suffer some cuts at the hands of the British censors. Oddly enough, I just learned this watching the commentary, but Michael Reeves was related to Roger Trevelyan, who was the head of the British Film Censors Board. And so, like when he heard about the cuts, like apparently he nearly attacked his uncle, and had did great harm to him. But Reeves was kind of a wunderkind. He was only 23 when he made this movie, and this was his third movie.
Wow.
So it was quite something for him to be heading up this production. He'd done two earlier films, one called The She Beast, which is not a great movie, but it does have Barbara Steele in it for a day. And so, like that was his first film. And then the second one was called The Sorcerers, and that had Boris Karloff in it. And Ian Ogilvy, who plays our hero here, Richard. And so Ian Ogilvy was in all three of those movies. Ian Ogilvy was kind of Reeves's muse, and they had grown up together. They were school time chums, and like Ian was going to be in all the movies that Michael made. But anyway, so this movie started as Witchfinder General. It was based on kind of a novel by Ronald Bassett, which was kind of a historical fiction telling the story of this real life character, Matthew Hopkins. Matthew Hopkins actually exists, and you can pull up the Wikipedia page on him and see all the terrible things he did. It's rumored that he did not suffer the punishment that he gets at the end of this movie, but that he died in his bed. He just went on his way, had all his riches, never was brought to justice, and died an old man.
Well, it's a consolation. I mean, for believers, I guess that's probably the last moment of peace he may have enjoyed.
Only hope
for eternity. Yes, but that's something that I really dug about this movie is you present the sort of religious hypocrisy on the one side, but there's also an earnestness of the faith on the part of the good guys. There's a great moment when Richard and Sarah, they kneel down and they sort of pray for protection and for Richard to be successful in his quest to avenge the murder of the uncle, and also Sarah's, I guess, ravaging. But it's never hokey. You get really the feeling that these are people who grew up in the countryside. Richard was conscripted, I guess, into war, and you get the feeling that it is sort of a religious war. There's talk about things being done to the murders of Christians and things like that. I don't know. I guess I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to get at here, but a lot of movies that tackle religion and specifically Christianity, there's sort of this idea that the entire thing is rotten to the core, or that the people who believe are dupes or sinister in some way. But I just appreciate the sincerity here without these characters being one-dimensional, especially at the end. One of the most shocking endings, and we've seen our share of shocking endings to this year, I think. But we'll get to what happens in that dungeon later. But speaking of dungeons and torture, the thing that creeped me out was Stearne. His preferred method of getting information out of people, it seems, was taking like a dagger and just like poking holes in people's backs. It is the
Right.
most unsettling thing because you can just feel it.
Well, and what the theory is there is that if the devil has left his mark upon you, there will be a point where you don't feel any pain. And again, it's kind of that no-win situations where, okay, I'll stab you and stab you and stab you, and you'll be in agony. And if I happen to come across a spot where you're numb, that means you're cursed with the devil. And it's like, so it's like I'm going to stab you and stab you and stab you, and eventually you'll just give up because the pain is so great.
Who the hell came up with this stuff?
Somebody with a really, they were smart about this. They're like going, okay, well, but I love these kind of catch-22, situations because it's so frustrating. And it's one of the reasons why The Crucible is such an enduring piece of drama, is that you see just how hysterical the countryside can be, how hysterical humankind can be, where in an effort to defer suspicion or blame, you cast blame on somebody else. And that, and that continues, that cycle continues and continues. And it's like a wildfire that gets whipped up, and everyone is touched by it by the end.
Well, the thing that struck me about it is, yeah, there's definitely that fervor in terms of what people would allow the horrors that people allow to go on. But one thing I noticed in a lot of these crowd shots where there are these public executions, there's the crowd, a lot of the shots of the crowd, they were quiet, they were kind of somber, they were
Yep.
watching, but they were very numb to it, probably because I've seen 100 of these things. But yeah, a lot of movies you see people like whipped up into that for like saying, yeah,
Right.
burn her, hang them or whatever. But there was like the exact opposite. And you get that feeling of fear. If they have any questions about what they're seeing, they're not going to raise that in that crowd.
Right. And they don't want to call attention to themselves,
Right. Yeah. It's terrifying. And I like that this film really gets into the process of what it was like to put someone to death, whether it's the opening of like raising that, the gallows, I guess, or the flotation, the floating test, as you kind of mentioned. I've seen other films where they literally just put people out in a lake or a pond and see if they float. In this,
Right.
they tie them up and they lower them slowly into this moat and try and drown them, and sometimes successfully. And then later on, calling back to the Wicker Man, which you talked about earlier this year, the Witchfinder, Mr. Hopkins decides I'm going to evolve my technique. I'm going to do something new and great, and people aren't even going to believe what they've seen, which is basically burning people at a mega stake, like this
Mhm.
almost cruciform thing that the victim is raised up on and then lowered very slowly onto the fire. And
Yeah.
this poor woman, it's gruesome, but it's not graphic. But you see essentially this burning from, I believe, Sarah's vantage point in the house that she's staying at. She's watching it from a window, but even just that much is it's almost too much. I was genuinely upset by some of the scenes I saw in this movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's upsetting. And it, as you say, it's, it's gruesome and graphic, and it's all real. That's the other thing. Like, this is all historical fact. Like, these things happened. Like, humankind was like, "Yep, let's let's burn these witches." Um, and again, I have to wonder. You talked about the faith. Like, I think some people believed that yes, there was evil in the world. Um, but I don't know. Like, I don't know how many people believed in witches. They believed that evil came in the form of people like, Matthew Hopkins. Like, that's true evil.
It is, and that's, I mean, we could do like 3 hours on the nature of faith in movies or outside of
Right.
movies. But I mean, that's the thing, is like I'm in the middle of reading. Well, I'm towards the end of reading the Bible right now, and it's fascinating stuff. I mean, I
Mm,
grew up religious all my life, and I'd never actually read the book until I'm 46 now.
mm,
Um, and there's a lot in there that I don't know. I wonder now. This is several hundred years ago, so I don't know what kind of access they would have to the scripture versus like going to a church and having people tell them what was in the book that they were supposedly,
Hmm.
professing. But yeah, there's just a lot of ungodly stuff in here that I don't even think is called for in this in the scripture.
Right,
At no
right.
point is like, oh, I think there's a devil in that person. Let's tie them up and burn them at the stake. No.
Well, and that's again, it feels like a lot. I mean, a lot of stuff that's invented, purely to serve humankind, not necessarily to serve God. And I mean, the argument can be made of how much of that is true for the Bible itself. Like how much of that is, where does that where do these stories actually come from? But yeah, it's Reeves has gone on record, or did go on record. He died. This was his last movie. He only made 3 movies, and he died. Um,
When he was
he,
what, in his early 20s?
oh yeah, yeah, he died, I believe, of some kind of drug overdose, like a barbiturate. And so no, this is his last movie, and if you watch, like, he's becoming a better filmmaker every single time. And the general consensus is that he would have been a major player had he gone on to do more films. But he was trying to make, and similar to Bonnie and Clyde, where Arthur Penn was trying to make an anti-violence movie by making a violent movie, by saying there are repercussions to violence. It's not just like point a gun and the bad guy falls down. It's like, no, like people get blown apart and people are bleeding out. And he wanted to put that violence front and center. And he said, I think it makes it a stronger statement if we actually see it, if we actually see that there is a repercussion. It's not. And Peckinpah, of course, took it to another level where it becomes almost cartoonish, where you're like, like, this is not how humans. But again, I think done in an effort to show like just how ugly violence can be.
I think what underscores it here is, we've spent the last few years talking about these Hammer films and Hammer adjacent films, and as I mentioned, this is one of the few that doesn't have any supernatural elements to it.
Right.
It is very violent, and I feel like we've seen this level of violence in other movies we've talked about, but it's not as upsetting because you could say, "Oh, it's a monster doing it," or it's something
Right.
being done to a monster. Whereas here, I mean, it starts off as a war picture. I mean, you've
Yeah.
got these soldiers out in the woods, and they get ambushed, and there's, I think Richard stays with the horses, and he accidentally, or not accidentally, but he saves the life of his commander, which comes into play later on in a kind of a touching scene. Yeah, it's one of those movies that I would watch the war part of it. I would watch watching the war, the Witchfinder General do his thing. Like all of the characters and situations in here are strong enough and presented maturely enough to warrant their own stories, their own films.
Well, and it's funny you say that, because it's not a big budgeted movie. That scene you're referring to, basically we're watching Richard listen to his fellow soldiers hunting down the rebels. Like we just hear these things and we just watch his eyes and reaction. It's not a big, sprawling hunt that we see. We just see one person. And I think that was Reeves had a great gift for economy, both in storytelling, but also there's these great shots of horses riding across the English countryside. And in many ways, Reeves said that he was making a British Western. He wanted to do for England what John Ford had done for the American, Southwest. He's like, I want to show Britain off, because a lot of times these British films, you would see them either in kind of like Hammerland fake cottage world, or it would be like in London, modern London, where you'd see the buses and the arch and the, Big Ben. But he wanted to show another side of England. And I think he does a great job. I mean, I think we get a sense of the beauty of England set against kind of the darkness of the story.
Yeah, and you've got the classic villain, the Man in Black, who in this case turns out to be wearing the garb of the person who should be the hero.
Right.
And that scene of Richard waiting with the horses, it does You're right. It is very economical. I think that's a great way to put it. But you think about the reality of that scene. He's
Yeah, yeah,
designated to stay behind. I think there's a part of him that wants to be engaged in the fight. Part of him that's possibly scared because he's a sitting duck. He can't
right.
he can't really fend for himself or hide certainly, and he has no idea where the action's going. Also, and it's something that's established early on in the film that we see throughout is you hear a gunshot and then you hear someone scream and they keep yelling and screaming. It's not like
Yeah,
you get shot and you fall over, you're dead. You get shot and you're maimed and it really hurts. I mean,
yeah,
our Stearne character gets a bullet in the shoulder and he's writhing around like a stuck pig and then digging out the shrapnel from his shoulder. And it's a perfect mirror to the sexual assault that we saw of him on Sarah earlier, where it kind of pans away and you hear him screaming bloody murder.
hmm,
I don't know what it's supposed to represent except for just visual symmetry, but it totally works.
yeah. Well, and you were talking about the other movies we watched, and one of the ones that we watched recently that wasn't supernatural was Frightmare, and where it's just darkness and humanity, and it's it being passed down from generation to generation. And our character of Rupert Davies, who played the father in that movie, he's the priest in this one. He plays uh, our John Lowe's character. And another character from another movie was Blood on Satan's Claw. We see Patrick Wymark as Cromwell, sitting there at the big table drinking his tankard of ale. And even though he's just in it for a moment, it kind of raises the production value. Uh,
It does. But it's also, I kind of alluded to this a minute ago. It's a strange moment of the sort of the warm fuzzies in the middle of this completely horrifying picture because you've got the big man sitting there at the table with his underlings, and you've got the general like really recommending this Richard guy for a promotion because he saved his life and because he's a valiant
right,
soldier, and he gets this assignment. It's kind of a big deal to take this posse and go track down this runaway king,
right.
but it's all sincerity. There's no threats to it. He's like, look, Captain, I trust that you can do this, and yeah, let us know how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I now so we should talk about like Vincent Price in this so Vincent Price, at this point he's a major, he's been a star since like 1960 was when he did Fall of the House of Usher with Roger Corman. And he'd done a couple of things prior to that, The Fly and a couple of films with William Castle. But he's, like he's been doing this for a decade now. Like he is synonymous with horror. And so when he was tapped to do the lead in this, Tygon, who also produced Blood on Satan's Claw, Tony Tenzer is our executive producer there. Uh, so Vincent Price gets tapped to because he knows he's going to bring some marquee value. But Vincent Price has done 75 films at this point. Michael Reeves has done 3. And so there was because, as I mentioned earlier, you don't see Vincent Price doing the Vincent Price thing. He's very subdued. He's very dark. That was all due to Michael Reeves. Michael Reeves and Vincent Price was incredibly frustrated with having this young upstart constantly telling him to stop doing that. And Vincent Price is like, what are you talking about? He's like, stop doing that. Stop doing the thing that you're doing. And he kept Vincent Price from coasting through what probably, Vincent Price thought, hey, I'll show up, I'll do my thing, and I'll go back home. And instead, he was forced to give a genuine performance unlike anything else he'd ever done before. And I think that's really amazing. But again, it was hard won because Vincent Price was like, I've done 75 movies. I know what I'm doing here, kid. And the story goes that Michael Reeves said, yes. However, how many of them have been any good?
Oh shit. Set of brass balls in that kid.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about that because I mean you're an actor. I have heard that, depending, some actors like to be directed very specifically and some like to be more freeform, but I've also heard that it can be a big no-no for a director to kind of tell an actor how to act.
Right.
Like that's sort of one of those things you have to figure out in the audition process. Like if you don't want this, then I'm not the person for the job. It's a little bit too late once I'm on the set.
Right.
How do you come down kind of come
Well,
down
I
on that?
think I mean, you hire an actor for their acting ability, and there's certainly, I mean, in this case, Vincent Price is being hired for his name, but Reeves did not want Price. Price was kind of foisted upon him. Uh, Reeves had a very different vision in mind. He wanted Donald Pleasance to play the role, and he wanted Matthew Hopkins to be this kind of tormented, that he was constantly using his power to kind of build himself up because he was very insecure. And it would have been a very different performance. But that's what Michael Reeves was envisioning when he co-wrote the story with Tom Baker. When Vincent Price comes along, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that sense of insecurity. Not to say Vincent Price couldn't have played that, but it would have been that kind of hysterical, Roderick Usher, Pit and the Pendulum type of thing where it's like, you just know that brand of Vincent Price. And I'm sure that Vincent Price said, hey, I've got my bag of tricks here. I know exactly how to say this line the way Vincent Price would say it. And Michael Reeves was having none of it. He's like, I don't want you to do Vincent Price. I want you to play Matthew Hopkins. And even Price, after he'd seen the finished film, he came back around, a gracious man that he is. He came back around and said, that young man got the best performance out of me that I've ever done.
Now, did you just say that after the director had died?
I don't know where the timeline was. I mean, Michael Reeves, I don't think died instantly. Like he did get to see this film, released and make a bit of a splash. He was slated to direct The Oblong Box, which also ended up starring Vincent Price. But he was slated to direct that for AIP before he passed away. So, but I think also Michael Reeves was aspiring to more, unsurprisingly. And I think he was a little frustrated by what he was being offered after Witchfinder General, and it wasn't speaking to him. And so I think that's part of where his frustration came from. But also I think he just he maybe had an issue with drugs. And as you know, it was the 60s, a lot of people were doing them.
Oh yeah. I want to talk about Hillary Heath for a second, our Sarah character.
Yeah. Hillary
you know,
Dwyer.
Oh,
is she Heath there?
On IMDb, she is. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, she's Dwyer. I think in the credits, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was like a married name or something. I don't know. But whoever she is, she was great. And I got to say, I was surprised because we've watched a lot of these kind of pictures with varying degrees of sensuality and outright nudity. And Michael Reeves is like the master of the tease, because you think you're just about to see, some real naked flesh. And I don't think there's any in this movie. And I think that's a testament to, some films we've talked about where they'll show gratuitous nudity, but there'll be sort of there'll be more of a sexual violence, or you shouldn't be looking at this and ogling these women kind of message. And that's sort of the same here, but we don't get the actual TNA. What we do get is a very strong performance from our lead actress. And what I love about the screenplay is we don't get the sense that she's a country girl, but she's not a bumpkin. Right. She knows how to play with the Witchfinder General, or the Witchfinder at this point. She's taking a gamble, an educated guess. Like, if I sleep with this guy, maybe my uncle will get, if not off the hook, then at least he won't be stabbed repeatedly in a dungeon. But there's not this naive moment like, I thought you were a man of God. No.
Right.
She knows what's going on. He knows what's going on, and the deed happens. We don't watch that, fortunately. But yeah, it's just such a great, mature performance. And at the very end, when she is being tortured and stabbed and then run across the table on her back, the back that she was just multiple punctured in. It's really harrowing. And I was waiting for that hero moment when Richard was going to get the better of his captors and embrace his love and all this other stuff. No, he ends up snapping, going insane, and hacking the shit out of Hopkins. Like when those soldiers finally, the cavalry cavalry comes down the dungeon steps and they round that corner and they see what he's done to this guy and what he's still doing. When the one guy pulls out the gun and shoots Hopkins,
Yeah.
and then Richard is yelling at him like, you
You took
denied
him from
me.
me. You
You
took him
took
from me.
him from me. And he
Yeah.
keeps, I thought they were going to shoot him because he'd become a rabid frothing dog at that point. And we end on Sarah's screaming face in a
Yeah.
still with black and white credits. What was your reaction the first time you saw this ending?
Well, and I'll answer the second thing really quick, is that that was the original idea, was that they were going to have to shoot him as well. And it was on the set that day that they realized, well, I've already fired my gun twice. I don't have any more bullets. And so they said, well, we'll end it on this downer note of him being deprived of his revenge, and Sarah basically having gone insane. Like, she's very much in that Sally from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in the back of the truck. It's like, yeah, she got away, but she's never going to be right again. And I love those shots, the empty hallways where you're just hearing her screams, and then they come back and just that final image of her. There has been a cost. Yes, our heroes have endured, but they are not. They are changed forever.
And I think that's there's so many brilliant layers to this movie, intentional or not. Maybe it's just me, looking for meaning where there isn't any. But the opening credits of this film are these great kind of, they're not exactly black and white. They're almost like blue and black stills of people screaming and in various states of distress. And you're like, okay, these are probably accused witches who are being burned or drowned or whatever. It doesn't have any impact because they're sort of abstract people. But by the time these end credits roll, we know who these people are. And it forces us to go back and consider whoever those nameless folks at the beginning of the movie were and how many hundreds or thousands of them there must have been during these little small town inquisitions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like to give credit to Paul Ferris, who composed our music, because I think he does it's an amazing score that kind of it elevates the proceedings. It gives it that sense of grandeur when you have these scenes of horses tearing across the countryside. There was when the film went into home video distribution, they did not bother getting the music rights, and so they just redubbed the movie with a synchronized, like a synthesizer score that is really horrible. And so when this film was restored to DVD and they put the score back in, it was a cause of rejoicing for everybody. The other thing that's worth noting is that this was released in America as The Conqueror Worm, Edgar Allan Poe's The Conqueror Worm, which is a short story that Poe, but they were trying to tie it into the AI Poe series, the Poe films that Price had done for American International. And so they had Vincent Price reading just a little bit, like a little passage from The Conqueror Worm that went over the end titles. And that's how they jammed Conqueror Worm into it. And so, it was still success, but I remember for years reading in reference books about Conqueror Worm, and then later finding out that it was called Witchfinder General. And then now Witchfinder General is what it's known as and accepted as. And Conqueror Worm is seen as kind of the inferior American cut.
Have you read the Poe story, Conqueror Worm?
I'm sure I have, but I couldn't recall it. It has nothing to do with this film.
I was going to say, because I love the title Conqueror Worm for this movie, because Hopkins is such a slimy guy, but he's also
and the worm that turns. Yeah,
right. it's beautiful. But now that you've told me the true story behind it, I'm going to forget I knew it and just say, yeah, it's a Witchfinder General.
Witchfinder General.
Man, yeah, I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that we can talk about here? I think we've covered a lot, but anything else you wanted to talk about with regards to our film?
Just the last little tidbit was that most of this film was shot almost entirely on location. It was shot in Norfolk and Suffolk, and the sets were built in airplane hangars, these kind of discarded airplane hangars, and that's where they built the sets. And it proved to be an incredibly financially worthwhile endeavor, because rather than renting a big studio space, they could just build their sets out in the middle of nowhere. Now, the trade-off to that was that a lot of the interiors had to be redubbed because it was so loud out in the fields, with stuff going on overhead, and whenever it rained, like it was banging down on the tin roof and things like that. So there was a plus and a minus to it. But and speaking of redubbing, our guy who played Stearne, Robert Russell, that's unfortunately not his voice that we hear. His entire performance is redubbed by another actor, because Reeves wanted the voice just to be pitched a little lower, and physically he's great.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, like, I think it was frustrating for the actor to see the movie and go, wait, that's not my voice. But that happened all the time, right? That happened all the
David
time
Prowse.
happened all the time in people's especially in England, where just actors and actresses were redubbed willy-nilly.
Yeah, we didn't talk about the bar fight, which was pretty spectacular.
Yes, it is. Well, that's what I mean. Like, I think Robert Russell, like as Stearne, he's such because he doesn't look like a very athletic guy, but he actually he's very nimble. Like he rides well, he fights well, and like flies over tables and things like that. So I love his performance. It's just when you realize it's not his voice, you're like, A, wow, movie making, and then B, like, oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, I mean, he's not the central villain, but he's just about on par in terms of, I think, like screen time and certainly screen presence as the person who is essentially his master. There's so much about this movie that I feel like I haven't seen in other films before, and I want to see more of, and unfortunately I don't know that that's possible. Why haven't people learned the lessons of Witchfinder General, Aaron?
I cannot answer, my friend. The witch hunts endure.
Okay, look, again, there's a scene where our two villains are riding on the countryside going to the next town. They're worried about getting caught. They run into a blockade of soldiers, and Hopkins basically does a distraction using Stearns as bait, and he goes off and escapes while Stearns taken captive. Right. And is threatening to be conscripted into being a soldier for the army. I'm like, what is going on here? And eventually they do catch up to each other, and they end up working together again because they're twisted, evil best friends.
Well, and also, I mean, like that whole sequence is the army just saying, we're taking your horses. That's how that was working, is like the army could just be like, no, we're taking what we want. Like that's a whole other side of things, is that, we've seen that in many a war film where it's like, no, you think that's yours, but it's ours. And you watch the abuse of power on multiple levels.
Right. Even Richard does that. He comes across a guy in a field with some, kind of ratty looking nags, and ends up taking one of them once he finds out that Sarah's in trouble. Right. So it's just, that's very interesting, because it is something that was just kind of accepted. People just said, well, at any point, my stuff is no longer my stuff. All right. Well, I think this has been a great way to wind down the year. We're ending on quite a banger. It's one of my favorites. But looking back on all the films that we've talked about this year, AC, you asked me to pick my top 3.
Yeah.
before we start recording. I'm gonna turn the tables on you. What are your top 3 out of this year? I'm gonna read you the list. You don't have
Okay.
to pull up the list. I have it here. Let's see. Theater of Blood, Village of the Damned, The Innocents, Curse of the Demon, The Wicker Man, The Haunting, Tales from the Crypt, The Legend of Hell House, Repulsion, Blood on Satan's Claw, Frightmare, and Witchfinder General.
See, I'd like to turn the tables back again, but I won't because that'd be bad form. But I think all of these movies are classics in some way or another, and I think almost all of them are in my 2 books, Horror 101 and Hidden Horror. Like several of these titles I was like, these are essential. Like you need to see Village of the Damned. You need to see Wicker Man. You need to see The Innocents. You need to, and then, for Hidden Horror, like Legend of Hell House got in, and, like things like, so it's like, so it's hard for me to say a favorites, but I think The Wicker Man, I think is a towering achievement. I would say that
Literally.
I would say that I would say the Witchfinder General is another one that I included in Horror 101. And honestly, actually, Curse of the Demon, Night of the Demon is also in Horror 101. I really like this journey that we've taken, because these were all films that were happening at the same general time that Hammer was coming to its heights. 1957 was when Night of the Demon came out, and that's also the same year that Curse of Frankenstein came out. So, I mean, I'm really thrilled to have taken this ride and been able to kind of like see, hey, this was happening. And many times it's in reaction to what was happening with Hammer. I mean, at Roger Corman's Poe adaptations were a direct reaction to what was happening with Hammer and what was happening with Mario Bava's Black Sunday. And so he did the AI Poe. And without the AI Poe, Vincent Price would have been the star that he was. And if he hadn't been the star, we wouldn't have had Witchfinder General. We wouldn't have Theater of Blood. So it's, like, I think it is kind of this wonderful organic examination of the genre, and all of them coming from that wonderful little British Isle.
Indeed. And it's something that, I mean, we see movies today and movie studios trying to compete with each other and capture the lightning of the zeitgeist. I mean, the best example I can think of, which is the cheapest, is like the comic book movies. Marvel starts out really strong. DC is like, hey, we want some of that and try and catch up. But you get the feeling that there's a concerted effort to copy and not to innovate necessarily. These films we've talked about on Beyond Hammerland, to your point, feel inspired by what Hammer was doing, and almost like not an attempt to do one-upsmanship, but to say, if we're going to make a Hammer style film, what can we do that's different, that's going to get people's attention and also be creatively satisfying for the people making them and also the audience. And I think that's what I want to see more of in Hollywood today. If I were to pick my tops, oh my goodness. Okay, Witchfinder General is definitely up there, as is Frightmare. That might be recency bias, but also Repulsion, which
Yes.
I got for on Blu-ray from Criterion for Christmas. I got
Thanks, Nana.
Yeah, well, I think that was actually my mom, who also gave me a copy of Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac Volumes 1 and 2.
Oh my! You've seen that, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, all right.
It was deep on my Amazon wish list. So when I got those, I was like, "Thanks, Mom."
Thanks, Mom. I'm feeling weird now.
Let's see. I'll have to go with Tales from the Crypt, Legend of Hell House, and Theater of Blood. Now, the other ones, not to say I don't love them, but there are some that, as we were talking again before we started recording, you reminded me of how I felt about some of them. Because I was like, I wasn't so high on all of them, but
Right.
but it has been a hell of a year going Beyond Hammerland, and I think next year is going to be the finale of whatever this iteration is. As we go back to where things start, we're going to return to Hammerland, AC, and it's gonna be a little different because, as you know, I started this YouTube channel in earnest during the pandemic, and we are no longer in pandemic time, so my free time is much limited. So I think we're going to go every other month next year for both Beyond or Return to Hammerland and Academia Giallo. So we're gonna close this out with yeah, what are some of the Hammer films proper that
Mhm.
we overlooked in our first couple of years? We're gonna give this whole genre a proper send off, and then who
And
knows what'll come in 2025.
when we did Son of Hammerland, I mean, we were kind of choosing movies that were examples of the different subgenres that Hammer dabbled in. Like, so we have not really dug in on all the black and white, thrillers. There were certainly many more kind of like prehistoric and grand fantasy epics. They did a lot of sci-fi. So yeah, I'm really excited to kind of go back and cherry pick a half dozen titles that are showing Hammer off at its best. So I'm looking forward to next year for sure.
Well, thank you. I am as well, and it's been a hell of a ride. So thanks, AC, for helping to plot out this journey. It's been a weird one, and I'm looking forward to getting back to basics in 2024. But yeah, folks out there, if you enjoyed this conversation, please go ahead and check out all of AC's stuff. I'll have links to everything below, including both of his books. I haven't pimped those out in a while, so yeah, look for links down below because they're bangers both. And yeah, AC, any closing thoughts as we end 2023?
This has been a great opportunity to revisit these titles and to be watching them because most of them I don't think you had seen before. So
No.
it's always exciting to revisit something that I have great affection for, to kind of watch it through the eyes of somebody who's coming to it for the first time. So thank you for that. It's been a real delight.
All right. Well, and folks, yeah, definitely continue checking out AC's Horror 101 with Dr. AC. You've got a lot of things cooking, and I'm scaling back, and you're ramping up to Zoom way past whatever I'm going to be doing on Horror 101 with Dr. AC. So definitely subscribe to his channel. Look forward to great things in 2024. And yeah, if you like this content, please like and subscribe and all that good business. And until next time, whenever that is, whatever that is, this has been Beyond Hammerland. Thanks, everybody, and take care.